Oh, back again with some bread for you. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to The Outsider's Perspective. My name's Ollie, and yes, this is your loaf of daily bread. Today's loaf of bread comes to us by way of the Roman Stoic Musonius Rufus, and he says the following. Wouldn't everyone agree that it is much better to work to gain control over one's own desires than it is to work to gain possession of someone else's wife? And for a person to train himself to want little instead of struggling to become wealthy? And instead of exerting effort to gain fame, shouldn't a person strive to overcome his thirst for it? Musonius Rufus here seems to be describing what happens to a person when they begin to develop mentally or spiritually, if you will. Because we kind of go through stages of development. Physically, obviously we do. We start off as little babies and then, we mature through childhood and then teenage years and then we become adults, But psychologically and spiritually, we evolve as well. And unlike the physical evolution that we undergo, there is no real physiological driver for psychological or spiritual evolution. In other words, whereas your body is going to develop and mature regardless of what you do, there's no guarantees that you will develop and mature spiritually in a similar manner. You have to actually work at it. It's something that you develop through deliberate practice. It's not something that just happens on its own. And so what Musonius Rufus is describing here is a person who has undergone at least some of that development, someone who has come to see the world in a different way. And he is contrasting this with what I would say is a more maybe typical or mainstream view of things, right? A person who lives unconsciously is basically driven by their desires, and it's unlikely that they'll ever stop to question those desires. But as a person begins to develop spiritually, and they start to wake up, if you will, then this shift occurs. And oftentimes there's a realization that it is wiser to work on controlling your desires than to work on obtaining the objects of your desires. Because obtaining the object of your desire is never certain, right? No matter what you do, it might not happen. You might not get what you want. And so, again, just as a matter of wisdom and prudence and practicality, wouldn't it just be better to control your desires? And then whether you get it or not, doesn't really affect you. Instead of working to be wealthy, why don't you work on needing and wanting little? Because then, whether you're wealthy or not, whether you strike it rich or not, you're going to be fine. You're going to be happy because you're used to and you're accustomed to having little and you don't want more. So again, attacking these problems internally rather than externally. And this is kind of the shift that happens. You have this kind of turning around moment where you realize that all these external things that you thought were problematic were actually just projections from within yourself. And that's really where the shift occurs. I used to refer to it as like the inside out view, right? Like most people live from the outside in. They look outside of themselves for validation, for value, for, a sense of fulfillment and wealth. And what happens when you wake up or start to wake up is you have this inside out moment where you realize that you've been doing it backwards, right? The external is very important, don't get me wrong. And again, we can debate whether there is an external or not. I mean, it's all one. The world that you perceive as being outside of you, the external world, is important. And I would never deny its existence or its relevance. I would just say that it's not actually external. It's all part of you and part of the single whole. But at the end of the day, you have to factor in what's happening around you. The issue is the emphasis that we place on the outside. And so this shift that occurs is that the emphasis is reversed. And now all of a sudden you start from within and you work your way out, right? Inside out. That's what Rufus is describing here. The shift that occurs when you begin to progress or evolve in a spiritual or mental way. Instead of chasing the wife, you start killing the desire, right? Instead of spending all this time and effort becoming famous, you redirect your efforts towards killing the thirst for fame so that you don't want it anymore. It's not something that matters to you, right? So yeah, it's an interesting shift, and it's not really something that you can force upon yourself, I don't think. Certainly not in my experience. It's something that happens to you. And I suppose there are certain things you can do in your life to basically hedge your bets, or, certain conditions in your life that are conducive to this shift occurring. But it's not like you can just force it any more than a gardener can force a seed to sprout, right? The gardener can only water it and make sure that the conditions are correct. And so in a similar manner, the only thing that we can do is ensure that the right conditions are there in our lives so that we can experience this shift and finally see the world from the inside out. And that's when you really can get a handle on things, because you realize that you can, right? The world out there, you can't control it, but you can manage the world within yourself. And in doing so, well, you know the deal, right? When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change as well. It's that simple. Anywho, that's all I got for you today, my friends. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you'll join me for the next one. Until then, live well, my friends.